You can see the prodigal son's father is one whom we read ran in the New Testament. And what for that would be to do, the guys would have to hike up their robes and cinch them around the waist with some belt so that their knees would be clear so that they could pump their legs and run with any degree of alacrity. And that's what Peter does here. He hikes up his robe, cinches it obviously, and takes off on a beeline for the tomb, running as fast as he can. Now we can see Luke's observation that for the most part, the testimony of the women fell on deaf ears. But there was enough credibility in their testimony that it excited Peter, obviously, to a fevered pitch, and he took off on a beeline for the tomb. And he saw the linen cloths lying by themselves, and he departed, marveling to himself what had happened. Now, the next segment of the testimony in Luke is the narrative of the Emmaus Road, which I have preached on, but it's one of my favorite resurrection accounts in the New Testament because it really is filled with humor. You wouldn't think that an account of something as important as the resurrection would have a humorous side to it. But I like to let my imagination run a little bit wild and pretend I'm hiding in a ditch along the road to Emmaus and have the opportunity to overhear this conversation that takes place here because it really is singular. Let's look at it. Now behold, two of them were traveling that same day to a village called Emmaus, which was 7 miles from Jerusalem. First of all, Christian art historically always depicts the two Emmaus road travelers as being two men. The text does not identify the two as both being men. The name of the one who is mentioned is male, but the pronouns that are used here could mean that they had a man and a woman, although the tradition is that it was two men. Well, in any case, be that as it may, two of them were traveling that same day to a village called Emmaus that was 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they talked together of all these things that had happened. Is anybody following this in the text with me? Are you following anybody with the New King James? Did you ever notice that I change the whiches to that's? You ever notice that? When I read from the New King James where it says which here, I change it to that. You notice that? Why is that? Because these translators use improper grammar, even in a Bible translation. Comma, which is a terrible thing to do. If you don't have the comma, you got to go on a witch hunt and get the witches out of there and get the that's in there where they're supposed to be. So I edit the Bible when I read it to you when I see that. Okay, excuse me for that. And behold, two of them were traveling the same day to a village called Emmaus, comma, which was 7 miles from Jerusalem. That's fine. And they talked together of all these things that had happened. So it was, while they conversed and reasoned, that Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were restrained so that they did not know him. It wasn't that there was something about Jesus being disfigured or in disguise, but what had happened here was that there was a divine intervention purposefully to prevent the people on the way to Emmaus from recognizing Jesus. And so he walks in beside them and listens to the conversation, and he says to them, "What kind of conversation is this that you're having with one another as you walk and are sad? You know, what's this all about?" This is Jesus playing Lieutenant Columbo. The one thing I don't understand here, he said, we need to tie together a few of these loose ends and so on. What are you guys talking about? What's happening? And the one whose name was Cleopas answered and said to him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem? And have you not known the things which have happened here in these days?" You must be the only guy for miles around who has no idea what's just taken place in Jerusalem. Huh? They're talking to the one who was the center of attraction in this whole thing. And so he said to them, "What things?" I love it, Tell me, what things? And so they said to him, "The things concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel." Boy, does that reveal a whole lot of what was going on in the minds and hearts of Jesus' followers. Just a couple of days after he dies, his exalted status in their eyes has now been reduced to being merely a prophet. He was a prophet, and he was a mighty teacher. He did great things. But bottom line is he let us down, because we had invested our hope in him that he would be the Messiah, that he would be the one who would deliver us and redeem Israel. And indeed, besides all this, today's the third day these things happen. Yes, and certain women of our company who arrived at the tomb early astonished us. Now, that's the one phrase that makes people think that these both are men, because there's the reference to the women who astonished us, and the ones to whom the narrative says that the women gave their testimony were men. So it really doesn't matter. Just another point. Then he said, "Certain women of our company who arrived at the tomb early astonished us. When they did not find his body, they came saying that they had also seen a vision of angels who said he was alive." You see, even now, they're discounting what in fact took place at the tomb. Now, let me just stop here for a second and explain something that we shouldn't need to have explained to us. But we have this tendency to think that these documents were written by people who were pre-scientific, pre-technological, who were basically naive people who lived at a former time where people were filled with all kinds of superstitions and mythology, and they lacked the sophistication that we have in our day. Like, we would never think of, for example, planning our days on the basis of our horoscope. Right? We're not superstitious like these people were in antiquity. But you have to get around this. It's an amazing thing for us today that if somebody came in here and said, "So-and-so was buried 3 days ago, and we went to the cemetery today, and his grave was empty, and somebody came and told us that he was alive and walking around," would you have a hard time believing that? Of course you would. Because if anything remains constant in our empirical experiences, is that when people die, if they're not resuscitated in a very short period of time medically, they, generally speaking, tend to stay dead, don't they? And, back in the first century, that wasn't the case. Back then, when people died, every now and then they'd just get right back up and start living again. You know better than that.